The cold autumn wind howled through the narrow streets of Santa Fe, New Mexico, carrying with it a sense of abandonment that mirrored Abigail Porter's own shattered heart as she pressed her palm against her slightly swollen belly. 3 months pregnant and completely alone in a strange town, she stared out the small window of her boarding house room, wondering how her life had taken such a devastating turn in a matter of weeks. The year was 1883, and Abigail Abbey, to those who knew her, had arrived in Santa Fe full of hope and dreams, accompanying her fiancé Thomas, who had promised her a new life in the bustling territory. He had talked of opportunity, of the silver mines and the fortune they would build together after their wedding. Instead, he had vanished one night with her savings, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibilities of marriage or fatherhood. Abby closed the threadbare curtains against the fading daylight, her fingers trembling. At 22, she had defied her parents back in Boston to follow Thomas West. They had warned her about him, about his charming ways and shifting eyes, but she had been too blinded by love to listen. Now she was paying the price for that foolishness. Her room at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was small but clean, one of the few respectable establishments that would take in a single woman in her condition. The widow who ran the place had looked at Abby with knowing eyes but asked no questions when she'd arrived 3 weeks ago, desperate and alone. 4 weeks, Mrs. Holloway had said firmly. I'll give you 4 weeks to find work and make arrangements, but this isn't a charity house. Abby's fingers clutched at the few coins remaining in her purse. 3 of those precious weeks were already gone, slipping through her fingers like desert sand. The seamstress work she had found with Mrs. Wilson paid barely enough for food, and certainly not enough to cover continued lodging and the coming needs of a child. A knock at her door startled her from her worries. "Miss Porter, you've a visitor downstairs." Mrs. Holloway's voice held an unusual tone, something between surprise and approval. Abby quickly smoothed her simple blue dress over her small bump and pinned back a stray strand of her honey blonde hair. A visitor. She knew no one in Santa Fe except her employer and the boarding house residents. Perhaps it was the doctor she had hesitantly visited last week, coming to check on her condition. When she descended the narrow staircase to the small parlor, the last person she expected to see was Ethan James, hat in hand, his tall frame looking decidedly uncomfortable among Mrs. Holloway's delicate furnishings. The foreman from the Double Creek Ranch stood awkwardly, his dark hair slightly damp from what must have been a hasty washing. Ethan wasn't a stranger exactly. She had met him twice, once when he'd helped her with her trunk when she'd first arrived with Thomas, and again last week when he'd wordlessly assisted her after she'd dropped her marketing basket in the muddy street. He had seemed kind but distant on both occasions, his blue eyes revealing little beyond basic courtesy. "Miss Porter," he said, clearing his throat. His voice was deep and rough, as if unused to speaking indoors. "May I have a word, Mrs.?" Holloway hovered nearby, making a show of dusting figurines that Abby knew she had cleaned that very morning. "Of course, Mr. James," Abby replied, gesturing to the faded settee while taking the chair opposite. Ethan remained standing, turning his hat in his large, work-worn hands. "I'll be direct, Miss Porter. I know about your situation." Abby felt her cheeks flush with heat. Was there anyone in this town who didn't know her shame? "I have a proposition for you," he continued before she could speak. "I need a wife. You need security. I own a small spread about 5 miles outside of town." Abby stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. James, if this is some kind of jest—" "No jest, Miss Porter." His jaw tightened. "I'm offering a proper marriage. You'd have my name, protection, and a home for you and your child." I'm not a wealthy man, but the ranch is mine, free and clear." Mrs. Holloway had abandoned all pretense of dusting now, her eyes wide with interest. "But why?" Abby managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's weathered face remained impassive. "I have my reasons, same as you have yours. It would be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. You barely know me." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're alone, I know you need help, and I know you're too proud to ask for it." Abby felt a flash of indignation, quickly followed by the cold reality of her situation. 4 days left at the boarding house. No prospects, a child growing inside her. May I? She swallowed hard. May I have time to consider? Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, relief, perhaps, that she hadn't immediately refused. "Of course. I'll return tomorrow for your answer." He nodded politely, placed his hat on his head and turned to leave. At the door he paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Porter, I believe we could help each other." After he'd gone, Mrs. Holloway settled herself beside Abby on the settee, her earlier disapproval seemingly vanished. "Well, Ethan James is one of the most respected men in the county. Not much for talk, but honest as the day is long. Owns that nice little ranch his father left him. Never thought I'd see him looking to marry, though." "You know him well?" Abby asked, still stunned by the unexpected proposal. "Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Lost his parents to the fever 5 years back. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a good heart. His offer is more than generous considering." Mrs. Holloway trailed off, but her meaning was clear, considering Abby's ruined reputation and unmarried state. That night, sleep eluded Abby as she stared at the cracked ceiling above her narrow bed. Marry a virtual stranger. Give her child a name that wasn't its father's. Live on an isolated ranch with a man she barely knew, but what were her alternatives? Return to Boston in disgrace. Struggle as a destitute single mother in a town that would forever view her as fallen. The next morning found her no closer to a decision. She went to her work at the seamstress shop, her fingers mechanically stitching fine seams while her mind tumbled with possibilities and fears. Mrs. Wilson gave her concerned glances throughout the day, but asked no questions. When Abby returned to the boarding house that evening, her heart pounded at the sight of Ethan's horse tied at the hitching post. He had come for her answer, as promised. She found him in the same parlor, this time seated, though he rose immediately when she entered. Something about him seemed different. He had trimmed his beard and wore a clean shirt beneath his worn leather vest. His eyes, deep blue like a mountain lake, met hers directly. "Miss Porter," he greeted her, his voice still gruff but somehow gentler than before. "Mr. James." She twisted her fingers together nervously. "I've been considering your proposal." He waited silently, giving her space to continue. "Before I give you my answer, I need to understand why. Why would you offer marriage to a woman carrying another man's child? There must be plenty of suitable young women who would make you a proper wife." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor momentarily. When he looked back at her, there was a vulnerability in his expression that hadn't been there before. "A ranch needs a woman's touch. I need." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I need someone who understands that this is an arrangement, not a love match. Someone who won't expect things I can't give." "And what can you give, Mr. James?" Abby asked quietly. "Security. Respect. A home." He shifted uncomfortably. "I won't speak false to you. I don't know the first thing about being a husband in truth. But I'll provide for you and the child, and I'll treat you both right." Abby studied him, trying to discern any hidden motives in his weathered face. All she saw was sincerity, perhaps tinged with the same loneliness she felt herself. "If I were to accept, what would you expect of me? To keep house? To help with the ranch when needed? Nothing. Improper," he added, the slightest flush touching his tan cheeks. And the child would be raised as mine. No one would need to know differently. Abby took a deep breath. Then I accept your offer, Mr. James. Something that might have been relief crossed his features. Good, he said simply. We can be married by Judge Parker tomorrow if that suits. The following day passed in a blur. Abby packed her few belongings, said goodbye to Mrs. Wilson at the seamstress shop, and endured Mrs. Holloway's fussing over her hair and dress for the ceremony. The landlady had even produced a small bouquet of dried flowers tied with a faded blue ribbon. Something borrowed, she said, pressing it into Abby's hands. From my own wedding 30 years ago. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike. Judge Parker, a portly man with kind eyes, performed the necessary rites in his office with Mrs. Holloway and the local shopkeeper, Mr. Finch, as witnesses. Ethan's responses were clear and steady. Abby's came as whispers. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Ethan hesitated only a moment before placing a chaste kiss on her forehead. His lips were warm against her skin, and for a fleeting moment, Abby felt something unexpected, a sense of safety she hadn't known since arriving in Santa Fe. After a simple meal at the hotel restaurant, Ethan's wedding gift, he'd explained awkwardly, they loaded her trunk onto his wagon and set out for the ranch. As the buildings of Santa Fe receded behind them, Abby felt the weight of her decision press upon her. She was leaving behind the little security she had known for an uncertain future with a man who was still, in many ways, a stranger. The journey took nearly 2 hours, the wagon bouncing over rough terrain as they left the main road. When they crested a small rise, Ethan pulled the horses to a stop. There it is, he said, nodding toward the valley below. Double Creek Ranch. Abby followed his gaze. Nestled between gentle slopes was a modest homestead, a sturdy log house with a stone chimney, a barn, corral, and several outbuildings. A small creek wound through the property, dividing to form 2 branches near the house, which Abby assumed gave the ranch its name. It's lovely, she said softly, and meant it. After the noise and dust of town, the peaceful valley had an inviting quality. Ethan glanced at her, seeming to search for any sign of disappointment. Finding none, he nodded and flicked the reins to set the horses moving again. As they drew closer, Abby could see more details: a kitchen garden beside the house, chickens pecking in a fenced yard, a few cattle grazing in a nearby pasture. It was smaller than she had imagined, but well maintained. Ethan helped her down from the wagon when they reached the house, his hands strong but careful at her waist. "I'll bring your trunk in," he said. The doors unlocked. Abby hesitated only briefly before pushing open the wooden door. The interior was simple but clean: a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a bookshelf surprisingly full of volumes, and 2 doors leading to what she presumed were bedrooms. She had barely taken it all in when Ethan entered with her trunk, setting it carefully against the wall. "The room on the right will be yours," he said, gesturing to one of the doors. "I took the liberty of clearing it out. It was my mother's sewing room, but I thought you might prefer your own space." Abby nodded, grateful for his consideration. "Thank you, Mr. James." "Ethan," he corrected quietly. "I reckon you should call me Ethan now." "Ethan," she repeated, "and I'm Abby." He nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Abby, then, are you hungry? I can fix something simple." "I can cook," she offered quickly, eager to establish her usefulness. "It's the least I can do. You've had a long day. Rest if you need to. There's time enough for all that tomorrow." Despite his reassurance, Abby insisted on helping prepare a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. As they worked side by side in the small kitchen area, she was struck by how efficiently Ethan moved, how capable his hands were with tasks she would have expected to confound a bachelor. "You cook well for a man living alone," she observed as they sat at the table with their plates. "Had to learn," he replied with a shrug. "Ma taught me the basics before she passed, said no son of hers would starve for lack of knowing how to feed himself. She sounds like a wise woman." Something warm flickered in his eyes. "She was. You would have liked her, I think, and she would have appreciated having another woman around the place." They ate in companionable silence after that, the awkwardness between them easing slightly as they shared this simple task. When they'd finished, Abby insisted on washing the dishes while Ethan went to tend to the horses for the night. Later, as darkness fell completely, the reality of their situation could no longer be avoided. Ethan built up the fire, then turned to her with an uncertain expression. "I'll show you to your room," he said finally. "I put fresh linens on the bed." The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin and pitcher. A colorful quilt covered the bed, its pattern complex and clearly handmade. "My mother's work," Ethan explained when he saw her admiring it. "She was skilled with a needle." "It's beautiful," Abby said sincerely, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "I'll leave you to get settled. My room is across the hall if you need anything. Good night, Abby." "Good night, Ethan." When he had gone, closing the door softly behind him, Abby sank onto the edge of the bed. The events of the day of the past weeks really crashed over her in a wave of emotion. She was married to a stranger, living on a remote ranch miles from town, carrying a child. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. What had she done? What kind of life had she consigned herself and her unborn child to? But as her eyes traveled around the clean, cozy room, taking in the thoughtful touches, a small vase of wildflowers on the dresser, a rocking chair by the window, the beautiful quilt, she felt a small flicker of hope. Ethan James might be a stranger, but he had shown her more kindness in 2 days than Thomas had in their entire courtship. Perhaps, she thought as she changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilt, this arrangement could work after all. Not as a love match. Certainly she had learned her lesson about rushing headlong into love, but as a partnership of sorts. A way for 2 lonely people to make a life together. With that tentative hope warming her heart, Abby drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since Thomas's betrayal. The next morning, Abby woke to the smell of coffee and the sounds of movement in the main room. Sunlight streamed through the small window, suggesting she had slept later than usual. Quickly, she dressed in one of her simple dresses, pinned up her hair, and stepped out to find Ethan already in his work clothes, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Good morning," he said, offering her a cup. "Hope I didn't wake you." "No, I should have been up earlier," she replied, embarrassed at having slept while he was already at work. "I'm normally an early riser." "No need to explain. You had a big day yesterday." He gestured to the stove. "I made some flapjacks, nothing fancy, but they'll fill the belly." They ate breakfast together, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been the previous night. When they finished, Ethan explained his daily routine, caring for the livestock, checking fences, and the 1,000 other tasks that kept a small ranch running. "I'll be in and out all day," he told her. "Feel free to look around, get familiar with the place. It's your home now." The word home sent an unexpected wave of emotion through Abby. She hadn't had a real home since leaving Boston, and even there, her parents' house had felt more like a beautifully decorated cage than a place of belonging. After Ethan left to begin his chores, Abby explored the house thoroughly. It was simply furnished but sturdy, with touches of the former Mrs. James visible in the handmade curtains and quilts. The kitchen was well equipped if somewhat disorganized, and the pantry was reasonably stocked with basic provisions. The main room held the biggest surprise. The bookshelf was filled with a wide variety of volumes, from practical farming manuals to poetry collections and novels by Dickens, Twain, and other notable authors. Abby ran her fingers along the spines, wondering which ones Ethan favored. Outside, she discovered the chicken coop, the vegetable garden that needed some attention after being somewhat neglected, and a small apple orchard beyond the barn. The land itself was beautiful rolling hills surrounding the small valley, with mountains visible in the distance. By midday, she had cleaned the kitchen thoroughly and prepared a simple stew for the evening meal. When Ethan came in for the noon dinner, he looked around the now spotless kitchen with raised eyebrows. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, washing his hands at the basin. "I want to earn my keep," Abby replied. "Besides, I enjoy having things in order." Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "Well, I won't argue with that. Place hasn't been this clean since Ma was alive." Over the simple meal of bread and cold meat, Abby gathered her courage. "Ethan, I know we've agreed this is an arrangement of convenience, but I think we should discuss certain matters." He looked up from his plate, wariness creeping into his expression. "What matters? Practical things. What your expectations are for me as your wife. What duties you'd like me to handle, how we'll manage when the baby comes." She placed her hand protectively over her stomach, which was just beginning to show beneath her dress. Ethan was silent for a long moment. "Fair enough," he finally said. "I reckon it's best to be clear from the start." What followed was the most straightforward conversation Abby had ever had with a man. Ethan laid out his daily routines, the seasonal work of the ranch, and his expectations, which were simple and reasonable. He would handle the ranch work and provide for their needs. She would manage the house, garden, and chickens. "As for the baby," he said, his voice softening slightly, "I meant what I said. The child will have my name and be raised as mine. I won't treat it any different than I would my own blood." "And other aspects of marriage?" Abby asked, her cheeks burning. Ethan's face flushed beneath his tan. "I won't make demands on you that way. This isn't that kind of arrangement unless—" He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Unless someday you wished otherwise." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Abby's chest. "Thank you for your honesty," she said quietly. "One more thing," Ethan added as he rose from the table. "I don't expect you to pretend to feelings you don't have. We're partners now, and I'll treat you with respect. That's all I ask in return." With that, he returned to his chores, leaving Abby with much to think about as she cleared away the dishes. The days that followed fell into a steady rhythm. Ethan rose before dawn to begin his work, while Abby prepared breakfast and began her household tasks. They shared the midday meal, sometimes in comfortable silence, other times exchanging small observations about the weather or the animals. In the evenings, after the chores were done and supper eaten, they often sat by the fire, Ethan whittling or reading, Abby sewing or mending. Gradually, tentatively, they began to learn about each other. Abby discovered that Ethan had been born on the ranch, that his father had been one of the first settlers in the area. He had a younger sister who had married and moved to California, and he corresponded with her regularly. He was 30 years old, could read and write well thanks to his mother's insistence, and had a surprisingly gentle way with animals. In turn, she shared carefully edited stories of her childhood in Boston, her love of literature, and her skill with needle and thread. She didn't speak of Thomas, and Ethan didn't ask, though sometimes she caught him looking at her with questions in his eyes. 2 weeks into their marriage, Abby was hanging laundry on the line when she noticed dark clouds gathering over the mountains to the west. The air had turned heavy and still, a sure sign of an approaching storm. She hurried to finish her task before the rain arrived. She had just pinned the last shirt to the line when a sharp pain seized her abdomen. Gasping, she doubled over, one hand clutching her stomach, the other grasping the laundry post for support. The pain intensified, and with horror, Abby felt a warm trickle down her thighs. "No," she whispered, panic rising in her chest. "Please, no." Another wave of pain crashed over her, and she sank to her knees in the dirt. "Ethan!" she cried out, but her voice was weak, and he was too far away in the north pasture to hear. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as Abby tried to stand, only to be driven back to the ground by another searing pain. Tears mingled with raindrops on her face as she realized what was happening. She was losing the baby. The rain came harder now, soaking through her dress, but Abby barely noticed. All she could feel was the pain and the terrible knowledge that the tiny life within her was slipping away. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when she heard the pounding of hooves, then Ethan's voice calling her name. Through a haze of pain and tears, she saw him dismount and run toward her, his face a mask of alarm. "Abby, what's happened? Are you hurt?" He knelt beside her, his strong hands gentle on her shoulders. "The baby," she managed to choke out. "I'm losing the baby." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a grim determination. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms and carried her toward the house, shielding her from the rain as best he could with his body. Inside, he laid her carefully on her bed and lit the lamp. "I'll ride for the doctor," he said, already turning to leave. "No." Abby grabbed his wrist, surprising herself with the strength of her grip. "It's too late, and the storm." As if to emphasize her point, another bolt of lightning illuminated the room, followed by thunder that shook the windows. "I can't just do nothing," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "Stay," she whispered. "Please, I don't want to be alone." The conflict was clear on his face, the need to act battling with the reality that there was nothing to be done. Finally, he nodded. What followed were the darkest hours of Abby's life. The pain came in waves, sometimes so intense she could only cry out wordlessly. Through it all, Ethan remained by her side, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, holding her hand when she reached for him, and murmuring quiet words of comfort. As midnight approached, it was over. The tiny life that had been growing inside her for nearly 4 months was gone. Ethan, with a gentleness that brought fresh tears to Abby's eyes, helped her clean up and change into a fresh nightgown. He built up the fire in the main room and made her a cup of willow bark tea for the pain. When he returned to her bedside, his face was drawn with concern. "Can I get you anything else?" Abby shook her head, too exhausted for words. She expected him to leave then, to give her privacy with her grief, but instead he pulled the rocking chair close to her bed and sat down. "I'll stay, if that's all right," he said softly, "in case you need anything in the night." She could only nod gratefully, too spent to question this unexpected tenderness. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, the last thing she was aware of was Ethan's strong, calloused hand gently covering hers. The days that followed passed in a fog of grief. Abby moved through her tasks mechanically, her body recovering even as her heart remained wounded. Ethan gave her space but stayed closer to the house than usual, finding reasons to check on her throughout the day. One evening, about a week after the miscarriage, Abby found herself standing at the edge of the property, staring at a small mound of fresh earth beneath an apple tree. Ethan had buried the tiny remains there, marking the spot with a circle of smooth river stones. She hadn't asked him to do it, hadn't even known he had until she'd seen him returning to the house, shovel in hand, his eyes red-rimmed and his face set in grim lines. The simple gesture of respect for her loss had touched something deep within her. Lost in these thoughts, she didn't hear Ethan approach until he spoke her name softly. She turned to find him standing a few paces away, his hat in his hands, uncertainty in his posture. "I hope I did right," he said, nodding toward the small grave. Seemed proper to have a place to remember. Tears welled in Abby's eyes, but these were different from the bitter tears of loss she'd been shedding all week. "It was very kind of you, Ethan. Thank you." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I know it doesn't help much now, but you're young. There can be other children when you're ready." "Other children," Abby repeated softly. The thought had not occurred to her in her grief that someday she might have another child. With Ethan. The idea should have seemed strange, yet somehow it didn't. Seeing her confusion, Ethan quickly added, "I just meant that this loss doesn't mean you can't be a mother someday." "I didn't intend to presume. I know what you meant," Abby assured him. "And you're right. It helps to remember that." They stood in silence for a moment, the setting sun painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally. "Maybe you'd like to go into town next week. Might do you good to see something besides these four walls and my sorry face." A small smile tugged at Abby's lips, the first in days. "Your face isn't sorry at all, Ethan James. And yes, I think I would like that very much." Something warmed in his eyes at her smile. "Then it's settled. We'll go on Tuesday. I need supplies anyway, and Mrs. Wilson asked after you when I was in last week." The trip to town marked a turning point for Abby. The change of scenery, the friendly faces, and the simple pleasure of selecting fabric for new curtains all served to lift her spirits. Mrs. Wilson greeted her warmly at the seamstress shop and offered her part-time work doing fine stitching that she could complete at the ranch. "I always need help with the detailed work," the older woman explained. "My eyes aren't what they used to be, and Ethan can bring the pieces back and forth when he comes to town." Ethan, who had been examining a display of pocket knives in the general store across the street, returned to find Abby looking more animated than she had in weeks as she discussed patterns with Mrs. Wilson. "Your wife has a real gift with a needle," Mrs. Wilson told him. "You're a lucky man, Mr. James." "That I am," Ethan replied, and though his tone was casual, something in the way he looked at Abby made her heart flutter unexpectedly. On the ride home, Abby found herself studying Ethan's profile as he handled the wagon. The strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, these details had become familiar to her over the past weeks. Yet somehow today they seemed different. Or perhaps it was she who was seeing them differently. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ethan asked, catching her gaze. Abby flushed, embarrassed at being caught staring. "I was just thinking how much I enjoyed today. Thank you for suggesting it." "No need for thanks. Glad to see you smiling again is all." As fall deepened into winter, the routine of ranch life continued, but with subtle changes. Ethan began teaching Abby about the workings of the ranch, how to predict weather from the behavior of animals, how to operate the small windmill that pumped their water, which wild plants could be harvested for food or medicine. In turn, Abby brought small refinements to their home: new curtains for the windows, wildflowers on the table when they were in bloom, bread fresh baked daily rather than the hardtack Ethan had grown accustomed to. She took over mending his clothes, subtly replacing the rough patches he had applied with neat, nearly invisible stitches. Their evenings grew longer as the days shortened. Often, they would sit by the fire after supper, Abby working on pieces for Mrs. Wilson while Ethan read aloud from one of the books from his shelf. His deep voice brought the words to life in a way Abby had never experienced, and she found herself looking forward to these quiet hours together. One evening in early December, as a light snow fell outside, Ethan closed the book they'd been reading and cleared his throat. "Christmas is coming soon," he said. "I usually don't make much of it, but I thought you might like to." Abby looked up from her sewing, surprised by the suggestion. "I would, yes. It's always been a special time. Then we should celebrate properly." Ethan's expression was earnest. "We could get a tree from the north slope, decorate it like my mother used to do. Maybe invite a few neighbors for Christmas dinner if you'd like the company." The thoughtfulness of the gesture warmed Abby's heart. "That sounds wonderful, but who are our neighbors? I haven't seen anyone since I arrived." "The Mackenzies are about 3 miles east, good folks with 2 young children, and old Pete Simmons has the place to the south. He's a bit rough around the edges but has a good heart. There's the Wilsons from town too, if they can make the journey." Abby set aside her sewing, her mind already filling with plans. "Yes, let's do it. A proper Christmas dinner with all the trimmings." Ethan smiled, clearly pleased by her enthusiasm. "Then it's settled. I'll ride out tomorrow and extend the invitations." The weeks leading up to Christmas were filled with preparations. Ethan brought home a small pine tree from the hills, setting it up in the corner of the main room. Abby fashioned ornaments from bits of ribbon, colored paper, and pine cones. They strung popcorn and cranberries, their fingers occasionally brushing as they passed the needle back and forth. Abby baked endlessly cookies, pies, and breads, filling the house with delicious aromas. Ethan contributed by hunting a wild turkey and helping to clean and prepare it for the feast. Together, they transformed the simple ranch house into a warm, festive home. On Christmas Eve, after they had finished the final preparations, Ethan disappeared briefly to the barn, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "It isn't much," he said, handing it to Abby with uncharacteristic shyness. "But I wanted you to have something for Christmas." Touched by the unexpected gift, Abby carefully untied the string and opened the package. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden box, its lid inlaid with a pattern of flowers that matched those in her wedding quilt. "Ethan, it's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "For your sewing things," he explained. "I noticed you keep them in that old cloth bag." The thoughtfulness of the gift, that he had observed this small detail of her daily life and created something so perfect for her needs, brought tears to Abby's eyes. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving a package from her room. It contained a new shirt she had made for him in secret, using fabric purchased with her earnings from Mrs. Wilson. The stitching was impeccable, with subtle embroidery at the cuffs and collar. Ethan held it up, clearly impressed by the workmanship. "This is too fine for ranch work," he said, though his pleasure in the gift was evident. "It's for special occasions," Abby replied. "Like tomorrow." The Christmas gathering was a success beyond Abby's hopes. The Mackenzies arrived early, their children's excitement infectious as they admired the decorated tree. Old Pete brought a fiddle and played carols while they waited for the Wilsons, who arrived just before noon with a bottle of blackberry wine and news from town. The small house rang with laughter, conversation, and music as they shared the feast Abby and Ethan had prepared. Mrs. Mackenzie complimented the cooking repeatedly, while Mr. Wilson engaged Ethan in a lively discussion about cattle prices. The children played with simple toys Ethan had carved for them, and even gruff old Pete seemed to soften as the day progressed. Watching it all, Abby felt a fullness in her heart that had nothing to do with the abundant food. This was what a home should be: warm, welcoming, filled with friendship and simple joys. As the short winter day began to fade, their guests prepared to leave, thanking Ethan and Abby for their hospitality. Mrs. Wilson hugged Abby tightly, whispering, "You've done wonders here, my dear." I've never seen Ethan so content. After the last guest had departed and they had cleared away the remains of the feast, Abby and Ethan sat together by the fire, enjoying a final cup of coffee. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. "This was the best Christmas I've had since my parents were alive." "It was wonderful," Abby agreed, watching the firelight play across his features. "I'm glad we did it." "Me too." He hesitated, then added, "You've brought something back to this house, Abby, something that was missing." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "You've given me something too, Ethan. A home when I needed one most." Their eyes met in the firelight, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with unspoken feelings. Then Ethan cleared his throat and stood, breaking the moment. "It's getting late. We should both get some rest." Abby nodded, though a part of her was reluctant to end this perfect day. As she rose to go to her room, Ethan suddenly reached out and caught her hand. "Abby, he stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I just want you to know that I'm glad you're here, that you're my wife." The simple declaration sent a warm flutter through her chest. "I'm glad too, Ethan, more than I ever thought I could be." He released her hand with a gentle squeeze, and they retired to their separate rooms. But as Abby lay in her bed that night, listening to the wind outside, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. What had begun as an arrangement of convenience had grown into something deeper, a true partnership, a friendship, and perhaps the beginnings of something more. Winter settled over the ranch, bringing short days of brilliant sunshine and long nights of star-filled skies. The cold kept them closer to home, and they fell into new routines, Ethan focusing on maintenance tasks that could be done in the barn or around the house, Abby continuing her sewing work and experimenting with new recipes from a cookbook Mrs. Wilson had loaned her. In January, a series of snowstorms isolated them completely for nearly 2 weeks. The forced confinement might have been difficult, but instead, Abby found herself treasuring the uninterrupted time with Ethan. They played checkers in the evenings, Ethan teaching her the strategy of the game with patient good humor. They read aloud to each other, discussed books and ideas, and shared stories of their childhoods. One night, after a particularly competitive game of checkers that Abby had won to her delight, Ethan surprised her by asking about Thomas. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," he added quickly, seeing her expression change. "I've just wondered sometimes about the man who left you alone." Abby was silent for a long moment, considering how much to share. Finally, she said, "His name was Thomas Mercer. We met at a social in Boston, and he was charming, full of big dreams and bigger promises." "He promised to marry you," Ethan stated rather than asked. "Yes, we were engaged. He convinced me to come west with him, said we would be married as soon as we reached Santa Fe." Abby's hands twisted in her lap. "My parents opposed the match. They said he was unreliable, that his family had a reputation for debt and dishonesty. I wouldn't listen." "You loved him," Ethan said softly. "I thought I did. Now I'm not so sure what I felt. Infatuation, perhaps, or just the desire to escape the life my parents had planned for me." "What happened when you reached Santa Fe?" Abby sighed. "He kept postponing the wedding. First it was because he needed to secure better lodgings, then because he had an opportunity that required travel. I was naive enough to believe him, even when I realized I was with child." Her voice grew quieter. "Then one morning, he was simply gone. He'd taken most of our money, leaving just enough for a week's lodging and a note saying he wasn't ready for the responsibilities of marriage or fatherhood." Ethan's expression darkened. If I ever meet this Thomas Mercer, he'll answer for what he did." The protective anger in his voice sent a warm current through Abby's chest. "That's very gallant of you, but I've made my peace with it. If he hadn't left me, I wouldn't be here now." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of how their lives had become intertwined by circumstance and choice. "His loss," Ethan said simply. "My gain." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Abby felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Thank you for telling me," Ethan added. "It can't have been easy to talk about." "Actually, it was easier than I expected," Abby admitted. "You're easy to talk to, Ethan." He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "That's a first. Most folks would say I barely talk at all." "You speak when you have something worth saying," Abby replied. "I've come to appreciate that about you." That night, as Abby lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, she reflected on how much had changed since that day Ethan had appeared at the boarding house with his unexpected proposal. What had begun as a practical arrangement had grown into a genuine friendship, and perhaps something more. The thought no longer frightened her as it once might have. As winter slowly yielded to spring, the ranch came alive with new activity. Calves were born, requiring constant attention from Ethan, while Abby began preparations for the garden, starting seedlings in small containers by the sunny kitchen window. Their partnership had evolved naturally over the winter months. They worked well together, anticipating each other's needs and sharing responsibilities without discussion. Abby had learned much about ranch life and found satisfaction in mastering new skills, while Ethan had gradually softened, smiling more often and speaking more freely than when she'd first met him. One mild March day, as Abby hung laundry on the line, she noticed Ethan walking up from the barn with an unfamiliar expression on his face, a mixture of determination and uncertainty that intrigued her. "Abby," he called, removing his hat as he approached. "Got something to ask you." "What is it?" She replied, securing a sheet to the line. "Well, I've been thinking." He cleared his throat. "It's been nearly 6 months since we married, and in that time you've become important to me." Abby's heart quickened at his words. "You're important to me too, Ethan." "The thing is," he continued, turning his hat in his hands, "our arrangement has worked out well, I think. Better than I could have hoped. But lately I've been wondering if you might consider." He trailed off, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. Abby waited patiently, hardly daring to hope he was suggesting what she thought he might be. "If you might consider making this a real marriage," he finally managed. "In all ways." The laundry forgotten, Abby turned to face him fully. "Are you asking if I would share your bed, Ethan?" His face flushed, but he met her eyes steadily. "I'm asking if you would be my wife in truth, not just in name. If you would consider building a real future together, maybe even having a family someday." He took a step closer. "I'm asking if you could ever come to love me, Abby, as I've come to love you." The simple declaration took her breath away. Love. Not convenience, not arrangement, not partnership, though they had all those things. Love. "You love me," she whispered. "More than I thought possible," he admitted. "It happened so gradually I hardly noticed until it was too late to stop it. But I understand if you don't feel the same. I know I'm not the man you dreamed of when you were a girl." "Oh, Ethan." Abby moved toward him, her heart full to bursting. "You're better than any dream. You're real and good and kind, and yes, I love you too." The joy that transformed his face was beautiful to behold. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her. When she stepped willingly into his embrace, he wrapped his strong arms around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Are you sure?" he murmured against her hair. I don't want you to feel obligated because of our arrangement." Abby leaned back to look into his eyes. "I'm sure, Ethan. My feelings have nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the man you are, the man I've come to know and love these past months." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, then deepening as they both surrendered to feelings long held in check. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "Someone to love who loves me in return." "Neither did I," Abby confessed. "Not after Thomas. I was so afraid to trust again, to hope again." "We'll build something good together, Abby. Something that will last." That night, for the first time, Abby joined Ethan in the master bedroom that had been his alone since their marriage. Their coming together was tender and unhurried, a natural extension of the love that had grown between them over the months of living and working side by side. As spring gave way to summer, their love deepened and flourished like the garden Abby tended so carefully. They traveled to town more frequently, no longer just for supplies but to socialize with friends they'd made at Christmas. They attended barn dances at the Mackenzie's ranch, church socials in Santa Fe, and even journeyed to Albuquerque for the territorial fair in July. In town, people who had initially viewed their hasty marriage with skepticism now commented on how well suited they seemed, how obvious their affection for each other had become. If anyone remembered or speculated about Abby's condition when they wed, it was no longer mentioned. One hot August afternoon, as they sat on the porch enjoying a rare moment of rest and a cool drink of lemonade, Ethan reached over and took Abby's hand in his. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "That sounds serious," Abby teased, though she could tell from his expression that it was indeed something important. "It is, in a way." Ethan met her eyes directly. "I was thinking it might be nice to have children, to start our family." The words sent a flutter of both joy and apprehension through Abby's heart. After the loss of her first pregnancy, the idea of trying again carried both hope and fear. Ethan, reading her expression correctly, squeezed her hand. "Only when you're ready, of course." "I know the thought might be frightening after what happened before." "It is a little scary," Abby admitted. "But I want that too, Ethan. A family with you. Children who will grow up on this beautiful land, learning from their father how to be strong and kind and good." The smile that lit his face was worth any lingering fear she might have felt. "And learning from their mother how to be brave and loving and full of grace," he added softly. As summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the landscape, Abby began to suspect that their wish for a family might be granted sooner than they had anticipated. Her monthly courses, regular since she had recovered from the miscarriage, were now late. Her dresses felt slightly tighter around the waist, and certain foods that she had previously enjoyed now turned her stomach. For nearly 2 weeks, she kept her suspicions to herself, not wanting to raise Ethan's hopes until she was certain. But one evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, the secret became too joyful to contain. "Ethan," she said, setting aside the shirt she had been mending, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the ledger where he had been recording the day's work, his expression curious. "What is it, love?" "I believe," she paused, suddenly overcome with emotion. "I believe we're going to have a baby." The ledger slid forgotten from his lap as he moved to kneel before her chair, his hands gently taking hers. "Are you sure?" Abby nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "As sure as I can be. It's early still, but all the signs are there." "A baby," he whispered, awe and joy mingling in his voice. He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Our baby," she confirmed, covering his hand with her own. Ethan gathered her into his arms, holding her with exquisite care, as if she had suddenly become fragile as glass. "I'll take care of you both," he promised. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes." "I know you will," Abby replied, stroking his cheek lovingly. "That's one of the reasons I love you so much." This pregnancy was different from the first in every way. Where before Abby had felt fear and uncertainty, now she was surrounded by love and support. Ethan was attentive to her every need, insisting she rest when tired, making sure she ate well, and taking on additional household tasks as her condition advanced. They agreed to wait until Christmas to share their news with friends, though Abby suspected Mrs. Wilson had guessed during their November visit to town. The older woman had given Abby a knowing look when she declined coffee, offering her peppermint tea instead, for the stomach. As her body changed and the baby grew, Abby found herself falling even more deeply in love with Ethan. The tenderness with which he treated her, the way his eyes would soften when they rested on her growing belly, the quiet conversations he would have with their unborn child when he thought she was sleeping, all revealed new depths to the man she had married. One snowy evening in January, as they lay together in their bed, the baby kicked vigorously enough for Ethan to feel it beneath his palm. His expression of wonder and delight was something Abby knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "Strong," he commented with a proud smile. "Like his mother." "Or her father," Abby countered, smiling back. "Do you have a preference, boy or girl?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "Healthy is all that matters, but I wouldn't mind a little girl with your golden hair and kind heart." "I was thinking a boy with your steady ways and gentle strength would be wonderful," Abby said, running her fingers through his dark hair. "Well, one of us is bound to be right," he chuckled, pulling her closer. "Either way, this child will be loved beyond measure." As winter slowly released its grip on the land, and the first signs of spring appeared, Abby's time drew near. Ethan had already arranged for the doctor from Santa Fe to stay at the Mackenzie's ranch during the last 2 weeks of April, ready to attend the birth when the time came. Mrs. Wilson had also promised to come and help, bringing her experience from assisting at numerous births over the years. On a mild April morning, with fruit trees blooming in the orchard and new calves frolicking in the pasture, Abby felt the first pains of labor. She was in the kitchen, preparing bread dough, when the initial contraction seized her. Unlike the sharp, tearing pain of her miscarriage, this was a powerful tightening that took her breath away but then subsided completely. She waited, counting the minutes until the next one came. 10 minutes. Then another. She finished shaping the dough and set it to rise before seeking out Ethan, who was repairing a fence near the barn. "It's starting," she told him calmly when he looked up at her approach. His hammer fell from suddenly nerveless fingers. "The baby. Now, are you sure?" "Yes, though it's early yet. The pains are still far apart." Ethan was on his feet instantly, his face a mixture of excitement and concern. "I'll ride for the doctor right away. And Mrs. Wilson." Abby placed a steadying hand on his arm. "There's time, Ethan. First babies often take a while. Help me back to the house, and then you can go." He insisted on carrying her, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. Once she was comfortably settled in their bedroom, he prepared to ride out. "I'll be back as quickly as possible," he promised, kissing her forehead. "Is there anything you need before I go?" "Just you safe and sound," she replied with a smile. "Now go, before this baby decides to hurry things along." The hours that followed were a blur of intensifying pain, punctuated by moments of clear awareness. Ethan returned with both the doctor and Mrs. Wilson just as the sun was beginning to set, and Abby's labor was entering its most difficult phase. While the doctor examined her, Mrs. Wilson took charge of the household, setting water to boil and preparing clean linens. Ethan, looking pale but determined, refused to leave Abby's side despite the doctor's suggestion that the birthing room was no place for a husband. "My place is with my wife," he said firmly. "If she wants me here, I'm staying." "I want him here," Abby confirmed between contractions, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. As night fell completely, Abby's labor intensified. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but Ethan's steady presence gave her strength. He wiped her brow, supported her when the doctor instructed her to walk, and whispered words of encouragement as she fought through each contraction. "You're the strongest person I know, Abby James," he told her as she struggled through a particularly difficult moment. "You can do this. Our baby is counting on you." Just after midnight, as a gentle rain began to fall outside, Abby gave the final push that brought their child into the world. The room filled with the indignant wail of a newborn, and the doctor's voice rose above it. "You have a son, Mrs. James. A fine, healthy boy." Tears streamed down Abby's face as the doctor placed the squalling infant on her chest. Tiny fists waved in the air, and a pair of blue eyes, Ethan's eyes, she was certain, blinked up at her through a veil of tears. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her heart so full it might burst. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan leaned close, his own cheeks wet with tears as he gently touched their son's dark hair. "He's perfect," he said, voice choked with emotion. "Absolutely perfect," after the doctor had examined both mother and child and pronounced them healthy, and Mrs. Wilson had helped clean and settle them. Ethan and Abby were left alone with their newborn son. "What shall we call him?" Ethan asked, cradling the small bundle with hands that had built fences and broken horses, but now showed only the gentlest touch. Abby smiled tiredly but happily. "I was thinking William, after your father. William James." "William," Ethan repeated, testing the name. "Well, for short, I like it." As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the new family dozed together in the quiet bedroom. Abby, exhausted but content, watched through half-closed eyes as Ethan sat in the rocking chair beside the bed, their son sleeping peacefully in his arms. The sight filled her with a profound gratitude for the unexpected path her life had taken. From desperation and abandonment in a boarding house to this moment of perfect joy, it had been a journey she could never have imagined. "Thank you," she whispered, causing Ethan to look up from his contemplation of their son's face. "For what?" he asked softly. "For knocking on my door that day and saying marry me, for giving me a home and a family when I had nothing, for loving me." Ethan's smile was tender as he rose carefully and moved to sit beside her on the bed, their son cradled between them. "No, Abby, thank you for saying yes. For making this house a home again, for loving me back." He leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on her forehead, "and for giving me the greatest gift I could ever receive." As the sun climbed higher in the spring sky, bathing the small ranch house in golden light, Abby James closed her eyes, her heart full to overflowing with the perfect happiness of the moment. From the darkest time in her life had come this unexpected joy, a loving husband, a beautiful child, and the promise of a future filled with possibility. The girl who had been left pregnant and alone in a boarding house was gone, replaced by a woman who had found strength she never knew she possessed and love beyond anything she had dreamed possible. All because a quiet cowboy had knocked on her door and said two simple words that had changed everything. "Marry me." Years later, on a summer evening as the family gathered on the porch of the ranch house, now expanded to accommodate their growing family, Abby would reflect on that fateful day with Ethan. William, now 5 and the image of his father, played nearby with his 2-year-old sister, Emily, their laughter filling the air as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. "You ever regret it?" she would ask Ethan quietly, their hands intertwined as they watched their children. "Marrying me the way you did, taking on another man's child," and Ethan, his face weathered by sun and wind but his eyes still as blue and kind as the day she'd met him, would shake his head without hesitation. "Not for a single moment," he would reply, bringing her hand to his lips. That was the day my real life began. And in her heart, Abby would know it was true for her as well. What had begun as an arrangement of convenience had blossomed into the deepest love and most profound blessing of her life. Two people, brought together by circumstance and need, had built something beautiful and lasting on the foundation of respect, kindness, and eventually, a love that grew stronger with each passing day. The family they had created together, their son, their daughter, and the new life currently growing beneath Abby's heart, was testament to the power of second chances and unexpected beginnings. Their story, which had started with desperation and uncertainty, had become one of hope and joy and love that would endure for all the days of their lives.